Ships are no longer idling at anchors outside of major U.S. ports. Fuel prices don't seem to be choking truckers, and we seem to be able to get parts for our refrigerators without waiting for months. Have the pressures on supply chains returned to normal, whatever that is, or do we still have missing or weak links? Those are questions for this edition of Global Sourcing Insights from CIPS. I'm Bob Rosbeck. My guests today are familiar: Dr. Jason Miller, Interim Chair of Supply Management at Michigan State University, Broad College of Business. Welcome, Jason. I'm seeing you quoted and recorded in all sorts of places, so thanks for joining us today.
I'm very happy to be on. Thanks for having me.
Also returning to the program is Dr. Rob Handfield. He's Executive Director of the Supply Chain Resource Cooperative at North Carolina State University. He's also the Bank of America Distinguished Professor of Operations and Supply Chain Management within the Poole School of Management at North Carolina State. And that is a title to end all titles. It's great. Welcome, Rob. You may not be all over the media like Jason has been recently, but you have been prolific in publications. Here's where you get to mention your new book, Supply Chain Immunity. I'm guessing you will be drawing from it today.
Yeah, this is a new book we just published. Actually, I have two books out. The first one is called Flow: How the Best Supply Chains Thrive. And, a lot of those are experiences based on what we've seen, what I personally observed during COVID and how the country is reacting to it in a post-COVID world as well.
Yep. Well, today's topic is supply chain pressure, and it starts with something the New York Federal Reserve started publishing just over a year ago, January of 2022. They labeled it the Global Supply Chain Pressure Index. They tapped into a number of data sets to create a one-number indicator that businesses might use to understand or project economic trends. At the time, their index had just peaked at 4.3. There was nothing like it based on data over the last 20 years. So this is what they had. This is what they came up with. And you can see Q4 2021 was way up here, and Q1 2023, it's come down the mountain, and we're almost at sea level or even a little bit below sea level. So that is where we got started with this conversation. The first question is, why should we care? What is the value of trying to compress global supply chains into a single indicator? Is the Fed onto something or not? Jason, you have skin in this game with your own index, which we will get to. But first, let's just figure out why we are generating this new data point. Jason, is it an important thing or just something for academics to argue over?
No, I think it is important from a standpoint of level setting everyone in the industry in terms of what is going on. So when you have these conversations about, okay, my lead times are 6 weeks now, they were 4 weeks before the pandemic, and it's because we're still experiencing disruptions. It just helps to level set things. And I think that that's what we need for a lot of collaborative efforts on this front. We need trust. We need folks to, accept at face value that there are issues or issues are getting better. And so having different indices out there that help quantify this is very useful. As time goes on, of course, there'll be an academic value of seeing, are these things predictive of various factors? We've seen that in economics with the creation of measures of economic policy uncertainty that have been used extensively to understand capital investment and things like that. And so a lot of the cases, you build the metric, you validate it, and then what you try to do is you see what additional value there is from a predictive standpoint.
Excellent. Rob, good idea.
I think the indices are really useful. And I think, Jason is particularly skilled at, getting into the narrative behind the data. And, I talk to a lot of executives on a daily basis, and I'm able to validate, a lot of the insights that are shown by the metric. So for instance, we were talking to some people in the U.S. Air Force, and they have, 18 F-18s sitting on the runway that they can't deliver because they're missing a single component that's produced in China. And it only takes one part to shut down a manufacturing supply chain. And we saw the same thing with the Japanese tsunami years ago. Toyota was shut down its facility or missing a small, tiny part, one part. So we have to be aware of these supply chains and understand the risks that are involved. And I think that's really starting. We've seen the dialogue, especially in DC, really escalate. And all of a sudden, everybody's talking about, supply chain disruptions and resiliency and so forth.
Excellent. Here we are. We can see the index peaked a year ago. 15 months later, the latest Fed index says global supply chain pressures have returned to normal with an index of just below zero. So you're looking at that. Now, Jason, you and a colleague created your own pressure index. Was it an independent project, or were you just disappointed in what you saw from the Fed and thought that you and your colleagues could do better?
It was much more that latter. When the original Global Supply Chain Pressure Index came out, which was in 2021, late 2021, early 2022. The big red flag for me was when you look at that image, there's this surge of it at the onset of COVID. Then it declines magically in the fall of 20. And then it starts ramping up again. And that intuitively didn't make sense. And so the Cleveland Fed had written a report talking about issues of raw material disruption specific to transportation equipment. And they cited some data from the Census Bureau from this quarterly survey of plant capacity utilization, which I'd never heard of before. So I went online, found all the data sets and cobbled them together and essentially created a parallel index based on the Census Bureau asking questions to about 7,500 plants each quarter in the United States of what factors are affecting your capacity utilization. And one of those boxes they can check is insufficient supply of materials, which would be, to me, the endemic measure of a supply chain bottleneck. And using essentially that metric as a comparison, and it's then came to find out more recently, Bank of Canada, as part of their quarterly business outlook survey, asked a random sample of about 100 Canadian firms that are representative of the Canadian economy, what factor, if you would have a surge of demand, what would be your biggest constraint? And one of those is supply chain bottlenecks. And so what I've sort of taken a perspective of is it seems that Bank of Canada, since 2010, and the Federal and the Census Bureau since about 2013, 2014, have actually been asking this exact question in a much more intuitive manner versus what the New York Fed is doing, which is really a statistical exercise, essentially maximizing the variance that can be accounted for out of 27 different series of data, many of which have been transformed in non-intuitive ways.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Jason. And my own personal experience, the nice thing about the manufacturing census data is that you can also break it down to a NAICS code level. And I've used some of the NAICS code level data on several cases where people have claimed, even in lawsuits, that there's been a disruption. And the data bears that out. And it's a third-party, publicly available set of data. And, there's some real benefit to that because let's face it, these cycles are different by industry. It's tough to lump them all together into a single number. And I think that's the problem with the New York Fed data is it doesn't really capture the complexities of what's happening at an industry level.
So I've heard the term K-shaped recovery being tossed around, meaning that some sectors are growing while others are going down. Is that kind of what we have here?
Yeah, I mean, that's we've always had that. I mean, the economy is always behaving that way. There's some sectors doing well, some sectors not doing as well. Right now, obviously, single family housing activity is very much down from where it was last year at this time and certainly 2 years ago at this time. But motor vehicle production is substantially higher because those raw material shortages have abated. And so I tend not to read too much into the K-shaped stuff because that's just the economy at any point in time. There's some sectors doing well. There's some sectors not doing as well. And so I tend not to focus on that quite as much.
So again, where do we think the trouble spots still are in supply chains, Rob?
Yeah, well, I think as Jason said, the automotive sector is doing really well. Automotive sales are up 17%. They just announced those results during the first quarter. Semiconductors, no more shortages. In fact, there's a surplus, and many of the semiconductor companies are struggling. So I think a general statement is we're getting better slowly. So things are improving. They're not improving at the rate that we would maybe like them to. But in general, and I think the Jason's charts show that they are generally improving, but they're still much worse than they were pre-pandemic in 2019.
Excellent.
Yeah. If I had to say areas where there's still endemic problems, aerospace, chronic shortages, based on discussions I've had with supply chain managers. And part of that is because of the ramp up taking place right now, and it takes a while for the suppliers to catch up. We've seen John Deere and Caterpillar note in their latest quarterly reports that while things are getting better, they're still having some issues with part shortages and getting availability. Construction equipment, farm equipment are sectors doing well. There's still, from time to time, we are having issues in auto, but it certainly has improved. There's still talking to firms that make electrical and electronic components. There's still a lot of issues getting sort of outside the semiconductor piece. There's still quite a few issues. But those are all, the key thing is these are all sectors where demand is staying strong. In contrast, if you go back a year and especially 18 months ago, there were rampant shortages in the chemical manufacturing sector. Those have largely abated because chemical production has decreased substantially. Same, for example, for paper manufacturing, same for plastic product manufacturing, where 18 months ago, demand was very strong, production was very, very high, in many cases higher than before COVID. Capacity utilization was well above pre-COVID levels. We've now seen that change. And so part of what has really eased things in some sectors has just been a cool down of demand, which does raise the question, if something were to happen that would trigger more demand, would we actually see some of these issues rear their head again? Because it's hard to ascertain how much of the improvement is truly upstream improvement in availability versus it's just we need less of this stuff. And that's essentially causing the easing.
Yeah, it's hard to know whether in other words, is it a lack of demand that is unclogging the bottlenecks, or is it actually better capacity?
Yep, exactly.
The other.
Well, what's your sense of that, Rob?
Yeah, the other factor I was going to say that plays into this also is labor, right? We've seen chronic labor shortages. The unemployment data is up a little bit. So people are going back to work. Companies are requiring people to go into the office 3 or 4 days a week now. So I think the labor situation is improving as well. And that's another big problem for supply chain shortages is not enough people, particularly if you look at truck drivers and warehouse workers and all the people who work in distribution channels and in retail. Those people are going back to work. And so that's easing the shortages as well. So I think we're starting to see people starting to actively go back to work. And that was also one of the factors that drove inflation too. Labor costs were going through the roof. So we saw rampant inflation, and a big part of that was due to labor.
Excellent. I'd like to go back to Canada for just a moment because CIPS has a significant presence there. And economic indicators in Canada tend to track what's happening in the U.S., but not always. The Bank of Canada did, as you mentioned, recently release their first quarter data, and supply chain issues were mentioned there. How did you interpret what they reported? Cost pressures still seem to be the dominant concern as I looked at some of their charts. Supply chain worries have subsided but haven't disappeared. How does Canadian business and the Canadian economy fit your model? Jason?
I would say right now it feels very much like the U.S. I mean, the big concern now we still have, like you mentioned, Bob, was cost pressure. But then the other thing is just waning demand in, various sectors. And do we have, there's so much uncertainty right now about where the economy is going to be heading through the rest of the year. And so I think that is, a key issue. And we even see that in the Bank of Canada, survey, is that in the, 2021 Q4, uncertainty was cited maybe 10% of the time, but now it's being cited as 40% of the time of your top concerns. And there is research that's just coming out from the Atlanta Fed and academics at Stanford, showing, okay, uncertainty has this, major negative effect on capital investment. It has a negative effect on employment growth. And so we can start to think, okay, as uncertainty right now is as high as it is, that is going to curtail a lot of the activity, capital investment and hiring, which hopefully accomplishes the goal of bringing inflation a little bit more back under control. We obviously had very bad news from a cost pressure standpoint with OPEC's oil cuts. From a demand standpoint, that's a mixed picture, because depending on the amount of oil drilling activity it spurs, that generates a lot of demand for machinery, for trucking activity. And so that's where it turns into a mixed bag in terms of high oil prices. It certainly benefits drillers, and therefore some downstream demand. But for example, it could hurt consumers buying discretionary products. So it may be a bad thing for imports.
Yep. So before the March meeting of the Fed, Jason, you offered reasons why the Fed should not have raised interest rates. Is it possible that their reading of supply chain pressure as returning to normal might have contributed to their decision? Their index was telling them that inflation was likely not coming from the supply side, so a rate hike to create pressure on the demand side was still warranted. Does that argument make sense? What do you make of what the Fed did?
So the Fed puts a lot of weight on core inflation, which is inflation excluding food and energy. The goal is a 2% target. I don't think that's a reasonable target anymore. I think we need to start thinking about a 3% target. And essentially, the reason I say that is we had a massive deflationary force starting around the year 2000, which was the normalization of trade relations with China. We were able to offshore so much manufacturing activity that it kept the costs of goods from increasing the way they would have if a lot of this activity had been done in the US. That, outlet is gone. If any, we're starting to see increasing migration of manufacturing out of China. We can see that in the trade data right now. February of this year, trade containerized imports from China in 23 are down 9% from February of 19, whereas containerized imports from the rest of Asia are up 24% over that period. So while we're seeing that movement out, there's nowhere else to move things that are done in the US that may have a higher cost structure. They're not moving overseas. If anything, things are moving back. So for me, I look and I say 3% is a more reasonable target. I don't like the idea of let's destroy demand to get wage growth under control. I think that's just not a sensible idea. And then the biggest issue I have with the focus on core inflation is housing is a huge percentage of that. And the housing data is known to lag, to the point the BLS and the Cleveland Fed just created a new index to try to better capture how quickly rental prices are changing. And so we're basing government policy off of data that we know terribly lags conditions. And so to me, raising rates is just destroying more demand when we know housing's cooled down. I mean, we can see that. And so to me, it's just doesn't make sense. We've had a banking crisis now that we still don't know how that's going to play out. So to me, it's pause the interest rate hikes, see what the economic data does. And if you have to raise rates, you always can. But to me, destroying demand is just not the answer.
Yeah,
Excellent.
I would concur with that, Jason. I think I wrote a blog back in August of 2020 that said, look, we're going to see high levels of inflation, and at that time, the Fed chairman said, "Oh no, those supply chain problems will work themselves out." Well, here we are, 3 years later, and they still haven't. And I think, the continued increase in rates, as you say, that's the biggest detriment to the economy right now. Because, again, suppliers rely on commercial paper a lot of times for their working capital, and they're really suffering as a result of this. And, I think the Fed is raising interest rates. It has nothing to do with interest rates. It has to do with inflation is being driven by these supply chain shortages. And the Fed's doing what they can to try to control it. But I agree. I don't even think we're going to see a recession. I think it's going to be such a soft landing that, we're going to not even notice the difference. And people have been talking about, oh, there's a recession coming. They've been talking about this for 6 months now, and it hasn't.
Oh, it's been longer than that. I remember people started talking about it last year in Q1 when we had a negative GDP reading that was entirely due to the import surge. I mean,
yeah,
the one sector I keep looking at is motor vehicles, and specifically light trucks. Set aside automobiles. We don't really buy those anymore. It's light trucks. March's sales were effectively, where they were in 2018 and 2019, which were really good years. When you look at the backlog, if you take 2018 and 2019 production, project that forward to today and basically say, what is the difference between what we made in 20 through today relative to that? You come out with a 2.5 million vehicle deficit when we purchase about 11 million of these things a year. So we have a multiple month of backlog of demand out there to be fulfilled. Auto loan delinquencies get too much attention because folks focus on a subprime piece. The problem is there's very few subprime auto loans today versus what there were before the global financial crisis. So the amount of auto loan debt and delinquency has actually been falling since COVID, according to Federal Reserve Board of New York data. Yes, I'm ripping on the New York Fed on the one hand and praising data on another hand for the different program. So to me, that's one of the most pro-cyclical sectors of the economy, and we're not seeing it slowing down yet. And so until I start seeing a sharp decline in demand for cars and trucks and SUVs, I'm not going to start worrying myself that we're going to have an actual recession.
So this is the recession that we've talked about for the longest time and never came.
Right.
Yeah.
And I don't think one.
No. And I mean, you look at the parts of the economy doing well. Agriculture is doing fantastic. 2022 was the most profitable year ever, despite record fertilizer prices, despite higher equipment prices, despite higher diesel prices. 2023 is shaping out to be, if not quite as profitable as 22, darn near close. That generates a tremendous amount of demand for activity.
Right.
The non-residential,
airlines are through the roof. Try booking a flight now. Impossible.
Yeah, people are traveling. Aerospace is doing well. We've got very robust non-residential construction going on. This is actually, I would say the economy today is actually better than it was in the back half of 2019, where we actually really were staring at going into a recession in 20 if COVID hadn't showed up, because we had weakening demand for motor vehicles. We had housing activity that was kind of blah. We had weakness in the agricultural markets. We were starting to see some weakness in non-residential construction. We were seeing weakness in oil drilling. We had a lot more red flags to me in the second half of 2019 for a future recession than we actually than we do today.
Excellent. Any final thoughts, Rob?
No, I think this has been fascinating. It's good to know that someone else feels the same way I do about the economy today, because I hear so many naysayers out there that are, worried about the recession, and I think a lot of them are working on Wall Street as well. So,
no, and my statement is tech is an important part of the economy. Tech is in a recession. But the U.S. economy, and especially the economy as we think about building things, isn't tech.
Yeah.
And so we have to be looking elsewhere. And as long as I see quit rates still higher today, people are leaving their jobs at a more rapid rate today than before COVID, we aren't in a recession.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Excellent. Well, a lot of food for thought there. Thank you both for joining me. Jason, let us know if all this sparring with the Fed affects your credit score. Rob, it's always a pleasure. We should talk about your book in another session. So thank both of you. This has been Global Sourcing Insights from CIPS. I'm Bob Rossbeck. Have a great day.